The Australian Financial Review.
Welcome to the Fin Election 2025. I'm Lisa Murray with political editor Phil Coorey, economics editor John Kehoe, and political correspondent Ron Mizen.
Well, this is the sweetest victory of all.
It's Tuesday, April 1.
I have always believed in miracles.
Who do you trust to keep the economy strong? Who do you trust to keep interest rates low?
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
The light on the hill.
Set it aflame again. Tonight, the Australian people have voted for change.
Hi, Phil, John and Ron. Welcome to our first Election 2025 podcast.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, great to be here.
Thank you, Lisa.
Ron, where are you?
I'm currently sitting at the very back of the Peter Dutton election campaign bus. So if you're hearing a little bit of background noise, that's because all of the journalists are filing onto the bus. We've just landed in Melbourne from Brisbane. And we expect to be touring the outer suburbs of Melbourne today, where Peter Dutton will be making some significant announcements around rail infrastructure.
Well, thanks for squeezing us in. It's going to be a bumpy ride for you and perhaps in the campaign as we head to the vote on May 3. The Fin podcast has gathered a panel of the Financial Review's finest political minds, led by political editor Phil Coorey, to take you inside the campaign, to analyse the polls every week and to break down those big issues facing voters. Phil, I'll ask you to get the ball rolling. We're now 5 days into the campaign. How's it going so far for both Albanese and Dutton? Who's had the strongest start? You've covered 11 elections. Who's had the strongest start?
Good morning, Lisa. Yeah, look, definitely Anthony Albanese's had a stronger start. He's been on message since day one. His confidence is up. It's a complete contrast to his beginning of the campaign 3 years ago, where he fouled up on day one and struggled throughout the entirety of the campaign. He's very much in the ascendancy. The polls are marginally in his favour, and I think he feels that he's turned a corner, before he called the election. So he's got momentum with him. I think Peter Dutton has been slow out of the blocks. He's struggled to stay on message. His cost of living message. He's become distracted too easily. A lot of self-owned goals in the first few days, such as his pronouncement that he'd live in Kirribilli if he won the election, and sort of getting wrong-footed on a few other things. And he's not really been driving home the key messages he's needed to drive home on cost of living. He left his gas announcement until the night before the election was called, and the petrol price stuff, and there's a mortgage announcement as I'm speaking to you today, but they're struggling to get, I think, to cut through on any of those at the moment.
So what have we had on the policy front so far, Phil?
Well, not much from Labor, Lisa, because Labor announced most of their stuff before the election. I mean, the biggest thing Anthony Albanese has announced is a task force into supermarkets, which, impressed really nobody, into price gouging, which no one says officially happens. But again, it's, it sends the right messages to the punter that, that they're onto the supermarkets, even though that's, I think, the sixth inquiry he's now promised into them. Dutton really hasn't done a lot. I guess if you conflate it with his budget night speech, the intervention in the East Coast gas market, the petrol price stuff, they flowed into the day the election was announced. But we've got some stuff as I speak to you today. It's a bit of a re-announcement from Michael Sukar on removing lending barriers to home buyers by lowering the interest rate buffer banks insist on when they give you mortgages. But other than that, it's been, sort of fairly slow. It's been more about sort of, who's got the funniest memes and the best insults.
Ron, you've been travelling with Peter Dutton for a few days now. What's he like on the campaign trail, and where have you been? Does it tell you anything about what he's thinking about campaign strategy?
It has been an interesting start to the campaign for Peter Dutton. We obviously started on a Friday, which means the first full day of campaigning was a Saturday. And over the weekend, we started in Brisbane with a tour of the 4X brewery before going to an event in Peter Dutton's own seat of Dixon. The interesting thing, there's been a lot of multicultural events over the past couple of days, a yum cha with the Chinese community, an Assyrian New Year's festival, and even a visit to a mosque. which is, if we had on the bingo card of things that we thought Peter Dutton would do in the first couple of days of his election campaign, attending a mosque probably wouldn't have been one of them. So it's been a peculiar start. Peter Dutton is sort of getting into his groove. There's a saying that there are two key things you need in an election campaign: good pitches and a good message. Certainly the pitches for Peter Dutton have been very strong, but he's had a couple of slip-ups along the way on the messaging front, struggling to kind of maintain his key cost of living theme, being blown with the wind on a few different issues like the Kirribilli House question and proposing further referenda.
John, this is a cost of living election. We had the budget last week with a surprise tax cut from the government. The coalition responded with a temporary halving of the fuel excise and its gas plan. That's where gas exporters would have to direct between 10 and 20% more product into the domestic market. Which side is cutting through on the economy?
It's going to be really interesting to see which voters prefer what policy. I mean, they're both quite minuscule when you think about it in the grand scheme of things. They're not big-bowed, ambitious economic policy. But Dutton is going with a slightly what I'd describe as economically populist, Australia first, little bit nationalistic sort of policy with the gas reservation for domestic users. Obviously, the gas companies have pushed back against that, saying that could jeopardise investment. It doesn't guarantee that prices will end up being lower. But it could be very popular with big gas industrial users in the manufacturing sector and people who don't like the idea that we're exporting all this gas overseas and maybe not keeping enough for ourselves. And then on his petrol excise cut, he's saying it'll be $14 a week. I think that's for people who actually fill up their tank every week and spend a full amount. It's not $14 on average, but for some voters out there in the suburbs, the regions who have longer travel distances, they're conscious of the petrol price, it may cut through with them, whereas Labor's gone for a much broader, smaller, it's not smaller actually, but it's a broader, small tax cut. That's everyone's going to get. It's about $550, but it's going to be phased in over the next 1 to 2 years. And I mean, I think most economists think neither of these policies are deeply serious. Labor's is probably superior on economic policy terms because Dutton's is a very sort of narrow, sort of temporary thing that doesn't do anything to improve work incentives or the economy. But it may actually cut through with the types of voters that Dutton's try to appeal to, the typical Labor working class voters in the outer suburbs and region. They're the target seats for Dutton, less so the inner city sort of teal seats.
Look, I think it's interesting. We've been visiting a lot of industrial-related facilities as Peter Dutton's main kind of visit of the day, where he's choosing to hold press conferences. Obviously, we went to the brewery. We've been to a brickworks in outer Western Sydney. We were at a manufacturing facility for coal mining equipment yesterday in the Hunter, or rather in Shortland, in the Newcastle regions. And he's trying to maintain this very strong focus on bringing energy prices down, bringing electricity prices down. Look, it's a very kind of broad message, more aimed at business, for example. I'm pretty surprised that we haven't seen Peter Dutton at a petrol station standing in front of the sign on the side of the street saying this will be 25 cents cheaper under me, frankly. It's been not a particularly retail start to the campaign, I think. But we are now heading into those outer suburbs where Peter Dutton says he needs to win in order to sort of claim a minority government or victory. So perhaps we'll see a shift.
John, we've had one interest rate cut. The Reserve Bank met today and they didn't move again, but they are expected to cut rates again. How do you think that's playing into the mood of voters as they go into this election?
Yeah, it's interesting because we've obviously got the rate cut in February. I think that's almost disappeared from people's minds. It's sort of gone out of the media and the messaging. I guess after the meeting today, it'll get a bit of airing again, the fact they didn't cut interest rates. But I don't really expect interest rates to be a big part of the campaign from here. I think broader cost of living pressures might be. Phil, what do you reckon?
Yeah, it just feeds into Labor's sort of line that the economic outlook is better than it has been for a while in terms of inflation under control and those sorts of things. But they're not singling out the interest rate cut by itself, because they know most people don't really wear that sort of cock-a-hoop just about one rate cut, but it's sort of more the sentiment that they want to sell rather than the individual decision.
Phil, we've seen geopolitics play into this campaign, mainly because of Trump, but also because of the Chinese ships that have been sailing close to Australia in recent weeks. The latest is this Chinese spy ship, which is sailing along the southern Australian coast. How does that play into the campaign?
It's probably a bit early to tell. I don't think it helps Anthony Albanese. He looked very weak, a few weeks ago when the Chinese naval ships came down the east coast and they did a hot lap of the country. And I suspect, the timing of this one is the same. I mean, this is a civilian vessel, supposedly. There's no such thing as in China. It was in New Zealand doing research work, but it's now decided to take the long way home. And there's a deep, dark suspicion it's sort of, mapping the seabed, including the big communication cable between Sydney and Perth. The Prime Minister was a little bit more seized of the urgency this time than the sort of laissez-faire attitude he evinced last time, so I think he's learned from that. But again, it probably plays into Dutton's strength on defence, national security. That is a natural area of defence both Dutton and the Liberal Party have over Albanese and Labor respectively. But at this stage, I don't know. I think Trump is having much more an effect on this campaign in a number of ways than the Chinese.
Yeah, Phil, it's all about Trump. So stay with us. After the break, we'll be looking at what the polls are telling us at this stage in the campaign, and we'll be taking a look at what both leaders are doing over the next week. Welcome back to the Fin Election 2025. I'm Lisa Murray and I'm talking with political editor Phil Coorey, economics editor John Kehoe and political correspondent Ron Mizen. Phil, what are the polls saying? Every week we're going to have a little look at the polls. It is a bit of a race call. These campaigns are a race call. So what are they saying at this early stage?
Well, mercifully, Lisa, they're all saying the same thing, which is good. So the poll we do at the AFR in conjunction with Freshwater Strategies, along with the Australians News poll and even the Resolve poll at the Sydney Morning Herald, which can be a bit of an outlier, and others like YouGov. There were 4 out on Monday, Sunday night Monday, and they all were in 1 percentage point of each other. Essentially, one had Labor at 51%, we had Liberals at 51%, and someone had them at 50-50. So on average, we're probably looking at around a 51-49 or a 50-50 split. So on that basis, and this is what listeners need to bear in mind, just because Labor, say, for example, is ahead in Newspoll by 51-49, at the last election, Labor won 52.1 to 47.9 or 52.2. So they're actually still, even though they're ahead ahead on a numerical basis, they're still behind the vote they achieved at the last election, and that's the important thing. So there's still a swing against them, right? So that would mean on a uniform basis, which you don't actually use because there's no swings of uniform, but just for argument's sake, they're still looking at fewer seats this election than they were at the last election, and that's a problem because they're only on 78 and 76 is the majority. So if you were to look at, in summary, all of those polls on the weekend, if that result were to be reflected on election day, most likely we're in for a Labor minority government. They're not high enough, sufficiently high enough yet for Labor to get a majority. They need to get to 52 or better, and conversely, Peter Dutton needs to get his two-party up to north of 52. I would suggest just to give himself a fighting chance of forming minority. So it's Labor ahead by a nose in terms of forming government, but that is a minority government.
It was always going to be a tough ask for Peter Dutton from the outset. The electoral mathematics suggested that he was always going to find it difficult to form a majority government. We did see the polls start to turn in his favour earlier this year, suggesting he was within striking distance of a minority government. But he's had a very shaky start in the weeks before the election campaign. He had a lot of ill discipline on his side. He had a couple of really, negative personal narratives that started to get out there around share trading, which sort of stripped a bit of paint off the opposition leader heading into the campaign. And certainly that struggle to maintain discipline on message has certainly been a key feature of his first couple of days. But look, you talk to any of the strategists, they'll say it's best that these things happen before or in the early stages of an election. Peter Dutton is a bit of an untested character in an election campaign. He hasn't done one as an opposition leader before. It's his first time before really the heat of a full court press pack. He will take his time to find his feet. So, we'll see how it goes. Only time will tell on that front.
Phil, can you give us the state-by-state rundown of how it's looking for both sides?
Sure. Look, we aggregated a bunch of data a couple of weeks ago using about 3,000 voters over a period of just under 2 months, and it's very different wherever you go. So Victoria has just turned on Labor big time. The Labor brand in Victoria is rat poison, and that is helping Dutton. They've had a 6-point swing back towards the federal coalition in Victoria since the last election. So that would give them anything from, depending how it falls on the day, 3 to 7 seats, which is their big hope. And Queensland hasn't moved, so that's still a coalition stronghold. So Labor doesn't look like they're going to pick up any, maybe one in Queensland, which is bad for Labor. The big surprise, Lisa, is West Australia, because the only reason Albanese won majority government last time was this aberration where they won 4 more seats off the Liberals in WA. And that was all about Clive Palmer and Scott Morrison and Christian Porter, actually, and Mark McGowan. It wasn't about Anthony Albanese. And we all thought, me included, that would come back over 3 years because WA is traditionally a conservative state, and all or some of those seats would come back. But what the data is showing is that WA has stayed strong for Labor. So this is not good for Peter Dutton, because he really needs to get 3 or 4 seats in the West to have a fighting chance, and that doesn't look like happening. And the most volatile state, the one I think where it's going to be won or lost, is New South Wales. There's a lot of marginal seats in New South Wales. There's been a small swing back to the Libs since the last election, about 3%, but there's a lot of line ball seats there, and that's really, I think, going to decide the election.
And John, let's take a look at what's coming up over the next week. On Thursday, our time, we have Trump's Liberation Day, the day he's threatened to impose sweeping reciprocal tariffs on trading partners. How will Australia be affected, and will voters blame the government if we are hit by extra tariffs?
Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty on the exact details that Trump is going to announce. My expectation is that Australia will probably receive some sort of tariff on the goods that it exports to the US. Probably, I would imagine, unless he goes with a uniform flat tariff for the same against every country, I would imagine Australia's would be smaller because we have a trade deficit, or the US has a trade surplus with us, and we're not as big an irritant. We don't have any tariffs on US goods coming into Australia, though there is a few bugbears in the trade and investment relationship with the US Trade Representative, as pointed out in a new report out today. And these are things like the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, the sort of approval and marketing of drugs on that, biosecurity laws blocking the sale of US beef because they've had mad cow disease over there in the US. That's been standing since, I think, 2003. Pork and chicken restrictions, apples and pears for biosecurity reasons, and also things like Australia's proposed, or we've already got it, but they're proposing to change it, the media bargaining code, where Google and Facebook are required to pay traditional media publishers like ours money to run news stories on their platforms. Now, interestingly, Albanese today said there's at least 3 non-negotiables, and he said it's the PBS, it's our biosecurity laws, and it's the media bargaining code. So he's really drawn a line in the sand, and I think he's trying to stand up to Trump. And my sense is if they do impose tariffs on us, which is very likely, I'm not sure that's a bad thing for Albanese. On one level, he looks like he can't get a phone call. He might look a bit weak versus Trump, but he is starting to stand up a bit more bullishly. And also the fact that he's trying to paint Dutton as the Trumpian-like character, even though that's not really quite true. Perception is everything in politics. And so in these times of uncertainty as well, voters do tend to swing towards incumbents. And Albanese has had his mojo on more in the last couple of weeks after looking pretty flimsy, frankly, over the past couple of years. And so I'm not so sure this is a bad thing for Labor. In actual fact, I think one of the reasons they've been helped in the last couple of weeks is because of the uncertainty created by Trump.
And what else should we be looking out for over the next week?
Angus Taylor is going to be delivering a speech on Wednesday to the National Press Club, the Shadow Treasurer. So he'll get an opportunity to put a bit more meat on the bones of their economic policies. I'm not sure we're going to see a lot of new policy announcements in that, but frankly, he's probably going to be reiterating they'll have stricter budget rules around taxing and spending, those sorts of things, and talk up some of their other policies to cut red tape for construction, the finance sector, things like that, as well as sort of obviously backing in Dutton's policies on the fuel excise cut and the sort of gas reservation policy, but he will also, he'll come under a bit of scrutiny and pressure from the press gallery that's remaining here in Canberra that's not actually on the road with the Prime Minister and the opposition leader. And so it'll be an opportunity for him to put forward his best pitch, but also, there are, questions about whether he can be as effective a communicator as his opposite number, Jim Chalmers.
What about you, Phil? What are you looking out for over the next week?
I just think the Trump factor, it's playing into this campaign in so many ways. As John said, it's giving Albanese a chance to muscle up to him. We've seen how it's benefited the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney. He's now got a real villain to fight, and he's rocketing in the polls over there. It's a little less, hysterical here, but nonetheless, Albanese, can push back at this guy because he's as popular as Boyles and has been, for a couple of months now. And the secondary effect of Trump on this campaign is the association voters are making with Peter Dutton. Whether warranted or not, it's a real thing. That's really sort of hurting Dutton. And I don't think Dutton helps himself when he sort of lets slip like he did on Sky News in the politics in the pub on Monday night when he sort of took a pot shot at the Department of Education for having thousands of people for not running a school. Now, he didn't say he was going to abolish it, but given Trump's just abolished the federal education department in America, you don't need to give your enemies much in an election campaign for them to run lines. So I just think most this week is going to be, Trump for good or bad and what impact he's going to have on the campaign.
And Ron, where do you expect to be over the next week?
No idea, Lisa. One of the beautiful things about the federal election is that we often jump on airplanes and have zero clue where that airplane is going. I couldn't tell you what hotel I'll be in tonight. I couldn't tell you what state or what city. We always have lots of guessing games on the bus. Victoria is an area where the coalition is expecting to pick up a lot of seats, or it certainly wants to pick up a lot of seats. So, we thought that we'd probably be here a bit sooner, but here we are. In terms of where we're going, no idea. It's one of those peculiar quirks of a federal election.
So how does it work? Do you just wake up and get a message and then you're on a plane?
Yeah, so usually we get a message late the evening before saying, your bag drop will be at 5:30. Make sure you're there. We jump on a bus. We head to the airport. There's a plane. This morning, of course, we were travelling from Brisbane, and we had, given that Peter Dutton had a very big announcement around this wanting to scrap funding for the suburban rail loop and plough money into the airport rail link here in Melbourne, we had a strong, sneaky suspicion that Melbourne was where he was going, but they certainly didn't tell us. So yesterday, for example, we were headed off from Sydney and thinking we were about to head to Brisbane because the opposition leader had a Sky News engagement last night. And instead, we found ourselves 45 minutes later landing in the Hunter Valley at the Shortland, or at the Williamstown Air Force Base, rather. Bit of a tour of that region and then back on the plane. So it's never dull, shall we say.
Yes, the election campaign is certainly not dull. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, John. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa.
Phil, before we go, every episode we're going to ask you for your favourite quote of the week. What do you have for us?
It was a toss-up, Lisa, between Peter Dutton celebrating the fact that the gas companies were complaining that his policy would create a glut of gas, because that's exactly what it was designed to do. But I've given the points this week to Anthony Albanese because even though he's commissioned yet another inquiry into price gouging by the supermarkets, even after the ACCC has just found there's no such thing, he was asked to give his definition of price gouging, and this is what he said.
Price gouging is when supermarkets are taking the piss off Australian consumers. That's what it is. That's what price gouging is.
Thank you for joining us for the first episode of the Fin Election 2025. I'm Lisa Murray with Phil Coorey, John Kehoe and Ron Mizen reporting today. The Fin Election 2025 is produced by Lap Fan and Alex Gow, with thanks to Debbie Harrington. Our theme is by Alex Gow. Lap Fan is head of podcast. Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us, as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you on Thursday for our regular program when we discuss Elon Musk, Tesla's challenges, BYD and the power shift that's happening in the electric vehicle market. Bye for now.
The Australian Financial Review.